Hey Mutiny members. So today I got something special for you. Got the full timeline and workflow of me creating this eye. So there will be a video, very short video, sort of like breaking that down, but this will be a more in-depth look for the full process and all the details that I just can't cover inside of the video. So what I'll be doing is I'll be going through a sped up version of it and just picking and highlighting all the points that are going to be useful for you. So whether I made mistakes or sort of tried to experiment with stuff that's not on the main video, there's lots of lessons that can come out of that. So starting off, the full sped up version is roughly 4.5 hours. So I think I 2x'd it. Maybe it took 8 hours in total. So that's totally the amount of time sort of in industry you would have to make an asset like this. Usually for something like an eye, we would have them pre-made, or a character artist would already have that in their library. So you can download this and actually use that as part of a member, use it on all your characters, for example. So here what I've started with is switching up materials and turning on the radial symmetry. And this is just to get a sense of the rhythm. Obviously it's super symmetrical now, and basically curling the inside so it's got a nice silhouette when it's viewed at different angles. So the normal map wraps around that internal edge. On the left side, you'll always see that I have those references available. I'm not super religious with it just yet. I'm just looking at it to see what sort of shape language. So for example, if I'm masking out something here, I'll take a very quick look to the left just to make sure I've got the right sort of shapes. So when you're masking, obviously it's really important because you can detect certain areas, but also predefine the shape without having to worry about like super guiding your brush along that state. So you can use masking for a lot of different things. Obviously, if there's a defined pattern already, we can do the mask and then just basically go back over it with the brush. So skipping ahead, it happens really quick. You'll see that I invert the mask and then just use the standard brush to give that almost like shelf look and that separation from the inside of the eye to the outside. And then using the standard brush to really haphazardly draw the kind of fibers. And then because we've protected it with that mask, once it's removed, it's going to look really nice. So here's something that didn't actually make the final cut of the sculpt, but it's still fairly interesting. I was trying to experiment around with unique ways of creating the eye. So what I did is I masked an area and then extracted that and then started to use the deformations to basically soften it. My theory was that I could then dynamesh this back onto the mesh and it would give that really nice separation. As I said, it didn't work in the end, but it was a nice thought. And also you can use this on different things. For example, it works really well on like liquids or like gooey sort of creatures and characters. I've definitely used it before, but you can see how I'm trying to first blend it back into the mesh so that when it is dynameshed, it will flow smoothly and it has that really sharp shelf on the inside. But as I said, I didn't use this and I replicated it a couple of times to save some sculpting. So around this sort of sculpting area is just refining and sharpening up the mesh where I can, so sort of like a secondary forms. What I usually suggest is I wouldn't do this across every single inch of the sculpt. I just do it in key areas here and there, so it gives the illusion that there's like secondary and tertiary details. You also see that I've switched up the mask, the material. So as I know this is going to be shining in the final shader, when you're in ZBrush, you ideally want to have your material as close to the final result as possible, because that's how it's going to basically be viewed. So on the main video, I don't usually show it because it's a bit confusing with the workflow to people just entering. But before I move on, I basically create a very quick test version for the bake. So this is just to test how my sculpt is looking on the low poly. So you'll see for this one, what I'm doing it very quickly inside of Marmoset. So it's just a little bit quicker where I can adjust the cage and just see how the low poly is accepting that high poly information. And then once I'm happy with that, I can then continue with the workflow. So as I said, it's not sort of like very sporadic hopping in and out of different softwares. That's what artists do. But for the full public videos, I very clearly separate it into chapters just so it's easy to read. But if you want to see the true version of how it goes, consistently putting it in and out of Marmoset, testing the textures, testing the bakes and things like that. So you see these crazy green lines? This is a setting in Maya. So it's just looking at where the normal maps of the low poly are looking. So you can Google to see those settings. Sometimes they can be accidentally skewed, but just by habit, inside of the industry, I always double check it before I export it or do baking like that. So that's another tip for you guys. So around here, I'm actually chucking it into Substance Painter, and that's just to get things like the ambient occlusions. And then eventually what I do is very quickly, I actually test out some generators. So I want to see how the high poly is generating textures and how they're going to look, because the entire texture of the eye is going to be based on the high poly generators. So I want to make sure that those are looking good. So inside the sculpt here, all I'm doing is making minor adjustments based on what I saw in Substance Painter. And then I can re-export that high poly, retest the masks, and just see how it's looking out. So here's much of the same sculpting, just zooming in a little bit zooming in a little bit further, polishing out and flattening areas just so it's not shining as much, and just sharpening up any details to help that mask. So here I wanted to test out a new technique for the inside of the eye. Obviously, there's a lot of fibrous detail on the inside. It'd be very difficult to sculpt, especially because it's all converging to the center. So what I'm doing here is very similar to what I would do with hair or hair strands, is making individual tubes with the tubes brush, and then using the array feature inside of ZBrush to basically rotate that all around. I would then make use of duplication. So I'd adjust this just to give it a little bit of variance, and then continue to duplicate them and move them around. So you'll see that I color it, and that's just useful to separate two different colors, because otherwise you're going to have a massive chaos of all these fibers. It'll be hard to see. So before I duplicate, I'll just color it red, and I'll also color the second one blue, I believe. So you can see the sort of effect that it gives. Imagine coming in and trying to sculpt that. And the added benefit that I was thinking is that it integrates really well to the outside of the eye as well. So it's got sort of like that layered effect. Because the inside of the iris is basically all these muscly, fibrous detail. And then I can just budge and adjust these around with the move tool. So the move tool is going to move all the red ones. And then if I want to move an individual ones, I can use the move topological. So by switching between those two, you can be really effective. I actually cover that in the hair tutorial. It's exactly the same sort of process. So I actually tried that same effect with the outside of the muscles of basically like those eyes and the fibers. I used the curves multi-tube. My theory was I could draw all of these out, and then what I would do is then dynamesh them together, and it would give this really nice fibrous combined effect. And then I could start to use the move brush and then basically define it back over. Eventually, it didn't work out. However, it is a really cool workflow, so you could use that for all manner of things. Again, it works really well for like stickiness, or the stretching of, say, for example, like a zombie's inside of their skull, like their jaw can get like a really nice stretching effect. So I got the tubes and then started to adjust it with deformations to basically inflate it. And you'll see the sort of effect it gives, kind of this sticky look. And I was going to stretch it back and forth to have this fibrous effect. So it's really highly detailed. I think in the end, I looked at it in terms of a time cap. I didn't want to spend too much time on the eye. So I think eventually I gave up on it and stuck to the primary sculpting. So this is a good topic, to be honest. Is like when you're making characters, while it is really cool, you've got to remember that the person's not going to be exactly right up into the eye, and they're not going to see this from a distance. It's just going to be like a blob of color. So I basically remembered that and tried to allocate my time more efficiently. But it wasn't wasted. It was a really cool technique, picked up that could be used somewhere else. And now I'm describing it to you guys so you can use it on different sort of projects for yourself. So next stage was actually making the outside cornea geometry. And I had issues where I accidentally came out of radial symmetry. So what I decided to do was make this cross section just to double check that I've definitely got my radial symmetry before. It's something I usually do, but for some reason I didn't do it, thinking that the radial symmetry was going to be okay. I accidentally moved it and it kind of all messed up. I'll also always put a male mannequin reference in, which is about 6 foot, just to make sure that the subsurface scattering and all the scales are okay for my renderers. To make the cornea bulge, I experimented with a variety of techniques, to be honest, combining sort of like a soft selection with the mask, also radial symmetry. Here I was adjusting the focal shift of the move tool itself to see if that would give me a nice sort of like adjustment there. I could easily do it with a move brush, but this being sort of like characterized and experimentation, I wanted to find the most optimal and quickest and most efficient way. I think what I settled with in the end was masking via the polygons themselves, coming into the mask settings that you see on the right side, blurring it, and then pulling it with a standard move brush. And that gave me like a really nice curvature that I was looking for the cornea. So I actually spent a good amount of time on adjusting how the transfer of the inner of the eye went. You can see how the border isn't just like a harsh cut off. It basically flows into the next. But before that, what's basically popped up here is if ever I'm looking at a reference, usually what I like to do is take it inside of Photoshop and then draw on top of it. So what I'll be doing is separating some different elements and just highlighting if there's holes and sort of how that language is happening, how long the fibers are going. So a quick look at the reference, I can just see this really bold, unique colors and then transfer that onto the actual mesh. So you can see all the array that came up there. We got some zones, we got some borders, we've got some sort of like lines of how the shape is flowing. So once I have that, I actually overlay it onto the mesh itself. So it all happens very quickly here, but I'll get the low poly, or sorry, this is the high poly that I've unwrapped. And I'm just making sure that everything is aligned to this texture and this outline. And then I use that texture on inside of ZBrush just so I can see the scale of how that's fitting on my 3D object. And I believe what I also do is I change this inside of Photoshop to make a custom height map. So adjusting the color zones to make certain colors pop forth with white, some of them to go back in black. Then overlaid that inside of the texture and just test that as basically a normal map, sorry, a height map. So I make a layer here and then paste that. So I believe there are multiple ways of actually applying the height map texture onto the ZBrush model. The way I prefer to do it, if you see here, is what I'd create is a layer. Create a morph brush just so it's saved, load the texture in. Then I use that texture as a mask. Then I get deformation to basically pull and draw out the mask. So the height map is used as a mask, and then I use the standard deformation. Alternatively, you can try and draw things out. So it happens in a fraction of a second, obviously, because it's sped up. I've tried to pause it here. So inside of masking, you can see there's a button down here called Mask by Alpha. So what you do is you load your texture into the alpha brush, and then you come down to masking, Mask by Alpha, and then it basically pastes that height map on. Okay, so here you can see that that is actually the mask. I then add a layer and then come into deformations and use the inflate slider, and you can see how it's now basically imprinted that mask onto there. And then obviously it's on a layer so we can hide and show it, but it's also a little bit messy. So I'll go back over and clean it up with just some standard brushes. Okay, so at this point, I'm thinking about retesting inside of Marmoset. So I get a really basic cornea texture, something I think I found on the internet and just took the center iris out. This isn't for the final texture, just to test my colors and how it looks on the high poly model. You'll see here, I've also very quickly hand textured the inside of the iris. I just want to see how the colors are displaying in Marmoset, what sort of lights I'll be using. So here you see inside of Marmoset, I've set all the objects up. So whenever I save out a texture, save out a high poly or rebake, it's going to come back in. I also just write in test there just so I know what I'm working with, or if someone else was working on this project, they'd understand that this is for testing purposes, not like the final render. So here is just inserting the normal maps, moving the light around slightly. I'm adding the microsurface or the roughness. It's just connecting all the textures and all the materials so I can have like a convenient workflow. Also at the same time, I'm also experimenting with the subsurface scattering just to double check that my scales are all okay and how that subsurface scattering is affecting the mesh and the textures. Is different for every single model, so I highly suggest it. Here I'm experimenting inside of Substance for the wobbliness of the outside mesh of the cornea. So it's just a standard 3D Perlin tileable, changing some settings, and then I'll export this. And because it's hooked up into Marmoset, I can see how that's shining. So when you do add that sort of wobble, it's a form of roughness in itself. So the roughness value is going to be generic across the entire model. The only thing that's going to remain, or something that's going to vary, is the normal map itself. So see on this Marmoset, You can see how the material is very, very basic. And then it's just about fine tuning the normal map from here and testing the roughness and also how the outside environment is reflecting back onto the eye. So back inside of Maya, what I'm doing here is with the low poly, I'm just making sure that it's well aligned to the high poly. So I take both of those meshes that I've made and just make sure that they're quite close to each other. So the bake's going to be nice. So it's a case of changing some materials so they're see-through, just so I can see how they're overlapping. You know, we're not using quad tool here. We're not actually physically drawing the low poly geometry. So in this case, we're just actually moving it so it's a little bit closer. Okay, so this is an interesting stage. What I do is once I've got the sort of final bake, I'll come into Substance Painter and make loads of different masks. So things like curvature, ambient occlusion, edges. I just try and extract as much information out of this high poly as physically possible. And you'll see they're all red on the right side. And then I use these in my texturing process. So I'll just copy them and then paste them. And therefore I know that I've got the most I physically can out of the high poly. So this is just sort of me experimenting with the different masks, using different levels and fills just to find different values in the height map and the curvature. Okay, so at this point, we've got something that is the high poly that's going to be used. It's also the low poly that's going to be used. Now come back into Marmoset and start testing that a little bit more. So you can see how these commentaries are going to be a little bit more useful because it's the actual full workflow breakdown of how it works out. So at this point, it's just experimenting with the lights, because obviously this will be rendered out finally. I also test out to see how the red masks, you know, the ones that I created earlier, how they're going to be presenting on the mesh itself. So maybe I need to make them sharper, maybe I need to make them softer. Then I'll come back into Substance Painter and adjust that. You also see I'm experimenting with the transmission and the refraction of the eye, just to make sure that it looks good from different angles. So you might be wondering, you know, why aren't I diving straight into texturing the eye and then just seeing how it works out in the final piece? It's a really good idea because the shader, because we've got multiple layers of the eye here, with subsurface scattering, refraction, it's basically going to change how the textures look. It's going to change how the actual object looks. So you continuously want to keep on testing it to make sure you're on the right tracks here. So next is a bit of more manual painting. This is just to get a more artistic feel of what the colors of the eyes are going to be, a bit more of a painterly style. I also define the outer ring, the sort of dark area of the eye. I believe I use a mask for that eye center, and then I use a filter called mask outline. And then with that mask outline, it creates a nice little ring there. So here we're getting a little bit closer to how the eye is going to look. So here I'm now starting to test some presentation lighting just to see how it's affecting the inside of the iris there and how that's all working. You can see how the cornea is popping out on the bottom right here. So up until now, a lot of the UV has been for testing purposes, so I don't spend too much time on the UV at the start. But now I'm coming back to the low poly and making a good high resolution version of the UV. So what this will involve, I'll eventually get to it. So I find it here, is selecting the area where the texture is going to be most important, where the detail is. You'll see I use a soft selection and then basically expand that. So it's taking up a majority of the texture. We're efficient with texture space. Really importantly, towards the border, you'll see that I'm making sure that polygons aren't super squished. And also on the edge of the eye here, you can see where the deformation is on the checker map. So you have the 2D and also the 3D at the same time, just to make sure that the texture is going to be as high resolution as possible. Also inserting a little bit of edge padding. So shell padding, edge and tile padding inside of Maya, just making sure that it's not over creasing on the border. And the back of the eye, you see I've offset that to the right again, so we can have the maximum amount of texture space. So with that back of the eye being on the right side, what it's going to do is just going to copy what is on the left, and it's not going to interfere with any sort of baking. So standard technique for making characters there. Okay, so around here, I want to make use of Photoshop capabilities, so more advanced features. So what I'm doing is extracting ambient occlusions and masks that are going to be important for me to guide my system. So you see, if you right click inside of the layers in Substance, you can actually export a map like this very quickly. And then I just align things. I also export a wireframe, so it's nice and easy to draw on top of. There's darts back and forth. I basically do multiple things at multiple times. So while setting up that Photoshop layer system, what I'm doing here is a very useful technique, which is testing the subsurface scattering. So what I'll do is I'll set different values of the subsurface scattering. So here you see it's 0. It's very like dark and black. I'll then take a screenshot and say that's 0 scatter. And so I'll play it and continue to play it here. I'll then turn the scatter up to something like 1 or 0.5. Then I'll also annotate that as well and put something like 0.6. So this is really good habit to get into. So you add that to your references, and then you can see when you're moving the slider, basically on your model, what that's going to achieve. So for example, what are my limits and how are they going to look? So I believe I was experimenting a little bit with Sampler here. So we're testing the cornea. So this is the one in Substance Painter. I wasn't liking how it looked for whatever reason. I think it was the lack of control inside of Painter. So I was experimenting with different masking techniques with like linear dodge and add and things like that. And then I tried to come into Substance Sampler. So I had more control of how the normal maps were layering on top of each other. So I really wanted to get a very specific wobble on the eye. And to be honest, what I found since Adobe has taken over, like this software is not good anymore. It used to be quite convenient back in the Adobe days. It actually used to work, but I found there were so many bugs on it that it was quite restrictive. So I think eventually what I used was Substance Designer, which is obviously got a higher skill cap, but because it's got a higher skill cap, it's just so much easier, especially for me to use. So here, what I'm doing is I'm testing out something called micro details. So it happens very quick in Marmoset here. Basically, these are the details that are tiled when you zoom in really close. So here I'm doing much of the same what we did in Substance and also Sampler, only regenerating it in Substance Designer so I can create everything at the same time. So I'm getting standard generic noise and then blending those together so it has my own unique noise. And you'll see that I'm playing with the histogram and the levels and hooking that back into the normal map and continuously testing it, how it looks with the detailed map and the overall normal map itself. So really, I suggest for you guys to just come in and experiment. There's no sort of set way of doing stuff. Here we're coming back to test how the lighting is affecting the normal map, because the normal map's going to affect the outer cornea and it's going to change how the refraction happens and stuff like that. So obviously with an eye shade, it can be a little bit complicated. Now onto the texturing process. To get the most sort of detail that's aligned to my model, I export the ambient occlusion into Photoshop, and then I'm using basic Photoshop manipulation to get the picture of an iris and then just basically convert that back onto my model. So I'm making use of duplication. I'm cutting sections out, Control T inside of Photoshop, and then using the warp functionality. And then you can basically match the flow and the language back onto your normal map or the ambient occlusion that we're using here. And it won't be 100% accurate, but it will look pretty good because we know for sure that this is how our actual model is looking. So I go around the entire thing and you'll see that I'm using multiple versions of warp, which is just like a gridded system to change a texture map. I then get something that's kind of Frankenstein together, but then what I do is I use Photoshop editing to blend it back all nicely, and then I overlay it for the background of the texture. I don't think I ended up using it that much. I came back into Substance Painter and then started to paint more layers from my masks. If you remember those red masks, we started to use those. Now here what I'm doing is I'm back in Marmoset. Now something went wrong here and I really want to showcase what sort of happened. So I believe at one point I re-imported the low poly mesh, and what it did was because I re-imported it manually, it actually re-imported everything with shadows. And on the outside surface of the cornea, you don't want shadows. So you want the light to come in there. So without me knowing, what it was actually doing was it was affecting how my final render was looking. And so I made all these adjustments and I brightened up really hard because obviously the shadows were dulling down and making it really gray. And I was quite confused because my values were really bright from my experience of rendering characters and stuff. I couldn't really work it out. And then so I experimented around and found that I had shadows on my cornea. So once I turned it off, I basically had to come back into Marmoset and start to relight everything. So here what I'm doing, getting closer to the final render, just experimenting with different HDRs. So this is going to affect how the reflection looks. So anything that's reflected is based on the environment. So for example, if there's like a window in your reflection, that's usually quite a nice effect. Okay, so for this stage, I'm drawing some of the veins inside of Substance Painter. I believe I started to do it in Photoshop, but it didn't give me the effects that I wanted. So I came inside, created a black material in Substance Painter, and then just got the mask with a basic soft brush to create the individual veins. So I changed a couple of brush settings, but I'm really relying on the pen pressure of my Wacom tablet. So being very artistic, and I'm trying to follow sort of the language and the lines of the underlying texture. And you'll see that I basically, the closer I get to the center, I take pressure off the pen, and then it gives a nice tapered effect. So this is very relaxing and fun. Go around the entire mesh and just do that. What I usually do is make it very extreme. I want it to be everywhere. And then inside of Substance Painter, I'll then blend that and hide it back. So here what I'm doing is I'm adjusting the levels and adding a blur so it's nicely radiated out. So here's also adjusting the height information just to give it a more rounded blood and vein look. I've then got a very deep and dark red just so I can see it. So once that's done, I'll put that into a folder, and then with that folder, I can then mask it. So you can see how it almost looks like the blood is coming in and out of the eye. Quite nasty, to be honest. I think eventually I toned this down much more. So after I've done that, you obviously want to see what the effects are inside of Marmoset. So at one point, I believe I wanted to change the subsurface scattering of the veins themselves. So I just added a feature inside of another texture layer that I could import in Marmoset there. So at this point, it can be sometimes a little bit off-putting because in Substance Painter, your mesh is going to look so much different than it does now in the renderer. So you see, I have really enhanced the normal maps, and it doesn't look so great in Substance, but it looks okay in Marmoset. So sort of for the final touches, I'm just going back over the layers of the mask and just enhancing, sort of pushing black areas back, bringing some highlights out, changing some saturation and lightness, and just previewing how it looks inside of Marmoset. So also inside of Marmoset, I create a very quick animation because I want to see how this is viewed in real time. So a couple of keyframes at different rotations, just so I can scroll back and forth through that to test the shading and the texturing. And now comes basically the final refinements, is taking any sort of procedural or repetitive elements out of there. So here I believe I'm breaking up the outer ring just to make it a bit more dotted, so it looks a little bit more realistic. Obviously here we've got a very intense set of veins. Now when you're previewing it, it can look a little bit different than it does when it's rendered. So I think I go off, make a drink or something, get a tea, and hit render. That's going to render out. When I come back, I can see the adjustments that I need to make. So here for the final bit, I believe I wanted a little bit more depth and deepness on the inside of the eye. So I came inside of Substance Designer and created a mask that would basically highlight the center. And then I used normal map blending to blend those two together just to give it a little bit more of an enhanced look. So the nice thing about that is I can preview it on the bottom left and see how that dip is basically going in on the center of the eye and really fine tune it. So that's one of the advantages with Substance Designer compared to Sampler or Substance Painter, is you get real full control of hooking this all together. So if you're interested in Substance Designer, I believe there's a video I made on Substance Designer for creating the leather of a shoe. So go find that on the members section. Now for the final rendering, there's no special workflow to go through. Usually what I do is I create a set of lights and move them around in different axes. You'll see on the bottom row, I have 3 different viewports. So that's the front, top, and the left. So I'll just basically scroll between each one of those on the lights and adjust them and move them around and see how it looks on the final render. So in Marmoset, you can outline these viewports how you like. So I've got the full quality one in the top right. And then it's a case of just scrolling through each of the lights, isolating them, seeing what effect it has on the final render, seeing if it needs to be there or if it needs to be enhanced, or you need to increase the contrast or the shadow. I can happily spend a day or two, just chucking around lights and seeing how the final render comes out. In terms of the final outcome, this is basically how the eye came out. What I did was I toned down the veins just so it looked a little bit more realistic, I guess. I wanted to go with something that was, nice and gritty. As a game artist, we do like to increase the grit and make it like really, really grungy. But I decided to tone it down in the end. So on the back, you can see there's just a replication of the UV. We don't care about that, obviously, because it's the back of the eye. And the majority of the resolution is in the iris itself. So if you look at it from the side, because of the refraction settings that we've set here, it's looking nice and realistic, and it's having its more physical properties. Now, there's a useful setting that you can do. Inside of setup, I believe, if you want a little bit faster and you've got a RTX card, if you come up to the settings here, you can actually change the upscaling mode and turn on DLSS. So see, this render is very, very quick, and it's quite a good representation of how the render is going to come out. And then on the top, on the render settings, this doesn't have upscaling mode on, so it's just a little bit slower, but it's also a bit accurate. So that's a nice little tip just to switch in between those two. So guys, that was basically a behind the scenes look of how this eye was created. If you like that kind of format, leave me a message and say so we can do some more of those. I like showing you the full workflow, so all the mistakes that are made, how we hop in and out of different things. Because on YouTube, it's just one really nice chapter by chapter, high poly, low poly, unwrap. But in real life, when you're a character artist, it really doesn't work like that. So if you want to download this eye, I believe I'll be sending it up onto the YouTube. There'll be a video on sort of like how to set it up, maybe switch up your own materials. So I'll link that in the descriptions below. And there are also other videos on actually how to physically make this eye and do things like ZBrush, low poly setup, and the texturing. So make sure you see those as well. So thanks for watching, and I will catch you on the next one.